Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to go over the story and lore of Axiom Verge. I've been wanting to make this video for a while but didn't want to do it until I'd finished playing the games themselves. Now, it's finally time. When I first played Axiom Verge, everything about it really clicked with me once I got into the story. At first, I was lulled into thinking the story was just an easily ignorable whatever, but as it progressed I found myself getting sucked into it. It has enough interesting ideas and mysteries going on that I really wanted to figure out. Unfortunately, I found that a lot of online discourse on the game's story was pretty surface level, or otherwise scattered around various places, and the game never seemed to get too much attention on YouTube. This didn't improve with the sequel. If anything, Axiom Verge 2 has gotten less attention than the first one, and has done very little to get people talking or thinking about what's going on, at least as far as I've seen. So this is my attempt to explain the lore, the story, a bunch of theories I have, and how I think it's all so interesting. Part of the problem with Axiom Verge's story, if this could even be called a problem, is that there's something like a hidden layer to it. If you don't pay too much attention, both Axiom Verge 1 and 2 have fairly basic standalone stories that are simple and easy to understand. But if you try to read all the scattered lore notes and start paying attention to subtext and names, a more subtle, mysterious story is going on. And it can be difficult to understand due to the use of complicated language and all the notes assuming the reader is already familiar with how the setting works. Most people reading them tend to just give up, and that's assuming they were interested in the story to begin with. I'm going to assume you've seen my playthroughs of the Axiom Verge games, or otherwise have played them yourself or seen others play through them. Instead of retelling the basic plot to you, I'm first going to explain how the setting works, and after that I'm going to look back on certain plot points of the two games with that new context. Keep in mind that the story is not finished, so there'll still be gaps. I'm also not infallible, so I could be wrong about everything, but hopefully I'm not. It's kinda hard to figure out the best place to start, but I suppose an obvious place would be with the title, Axiom Verge. I've seen lots of people be confused by this title and what it means, some even thinking it means nothing and it's just a conglomerate of cool-sounding words. Well, allow me to elucidate. Verge means edge or border. Other synonyms off the top of my head as I think this right now would be terminus or brink. It's not a very commonly used word except when saying you're on the verge of something, like a breakthrough or some notable event. But I think that word use in particular is misleading. A verge is an edge, and in this particular case we should think about it as meaning edge. So what is an axiom? Some of you listening might know the answer to this because it's used in mathematics and also logic. An axiom is, simply speaking, an unproven assumption which you build the rest of a system on. Typically, an axiom is seen as self-evident or otherwise obvious, but really an axiom just needs to be held as true for the case being discussed. So I suggest reading the title Axiom Verge as Axiom Edge, where we're using edge as an edge case. An edge case is a scenario that occurs at the extreme limits of a system's normal boundaries, usually where the system starts to break down. I might have just thrown a lot of words at you, so let's take an example. Imagine a simple program meant to add multiple numbers. This program can add 1 and 2, or 1 and 2 and 3, but what if it was asked to add together no numbers, or just one number? What if you divided by 0 or multiplied by infinity? One of those isn't even a number. Depending on how the program was written, any number of errors could generate. So going back to the title of the game, Axiom Verge is meant to evoke the outer boundaries of the axiom, where the axiom starts to break down. Well, we know what an axiom is, but what is the axiom the title is referring to? There's a note in the first game titled, appropriately enough, Axiom 1, A. All algorithms are universal and valid, regardless of whether they are executed. B. Cognition is a sub-algorithm whose behavior is to perceive properties of the parent algorithm describing it. C. Any algorithm giving rise to cognitive entities will be perceived as reality by the entities described. This is stated to be a section from Trace's paper, the paper he described as a new theory of everything. It's said to be an axiom, so we're to assume it's true. This is part of how the world works, and while it's only Axiom 1, so there might be other axioms, it's sufficient, I think, to get perspective on the title to give us a starting point. Because let's be honest, who reads that and immediately understands what it means? Besides me. Nobody, probably. So let me summarize. First, an algorithm is a procedure that takes inputs, follows its procedure, and spits out outputs. Generally speaking, a cooking recipe is an algorithm as much as a computer program, though obviously a computer program is more relevant here. So, does that clear things up? No. What if I said to replace algorithm with universe? What this is really getting at is that all hypothetical universes are just as real as other hypothetical universes. because all that reality entails is just being able to perceive it while inside. There was this little known movie called The Matrix that came out in 1999. Maybe you've heard of it. In it, a character named Morpheus asked the question,
what is real? How do you define real?
Axiom Verge would define both the real world and the Matrix as equally real. In fact, the Matrix, as in the virtual world described in the films, would be real even if the humans blew up all the servers it existed on. The film explains there have been previous matrices, and they are created, become unstable, and are destroyed, and then rebuilt. But Axiom Verge would say those other matrices continue to exist. So how is this supposed to make any sense at all? A lot of clarification comes from a series of, for lack of a better word, blog posts Thomas Happ made on his site titled The Omniverse. Thomas Happ, for those who don't know, is the sole creator of the Axiom Verge games, the one who programmed the game, made the music, drew the art, everything. So we can look at these posts for clarification. Happ asks us to imagine a simulation that describes a single conscious individual in a normal world. The simulation describes everything in exacting detail and simulates this AI as a normal person. Now we could run this simulation on a computer, but a computer just runs programs, that is, algorithms, and programs are just ones and zeros. Instead of a computer, you could painstakingly write out those ones and zeros on sheets of paper. Thomas Happ asks us to consider that both of these scenarios are exactly as real as each other, as far as the person described in the simulation is concerned. In fact, Thomas Happ tells us these two people are the exact same person. As an example of what he means here, 1 + 1 = 2 is an equation that's just true, universally, you might say. If I'm saying that equation now, and you write it down on paper in front of you, it's not two different equations, it's the same equation instantiated in two different places. Now I could really get into this, but I think that's as far as we need to go. Instead, let's go back to this hypothetical simulation with a man inside. What happens if there's a fire and half the papers are burned? Does the man even notice? Thomas Happ says he doesn't. Let's move on to another situation discussed in the Omniverse. If we're saying that minds are algorithms and algorithms are universal and valid, what happens if one dies? We have an in-game note for that. Focusing on the first part of the note, journal page Uruku in Axiom Verge 1, we know that the mind, like Euclid's algorithm, is eternal, existing equally across all universes in which it appears. It can never perceive its own demise, rather the instances which do not cease carry on for those that do. For most of us, this happens without us being any the wiser. But recall, we don't need to execute algorithms for them to be real. In our hypothetical simulation with a man in it, if that man dies, there's a hypothetical unexecuted virtual world in which that man didn't die. Maybe he died a second later. Maybe he dies never. Changing track slightly, if all algorithms exist, what about bad or malignant algorithms? That is, algorithms that don't produce anything, or are outright hostile to life. Say for example, a universe exactly like ours, but there's a universal constant that says after a certain amount of time passes, every atom shreds apart. That's a malignant rule. But what about a hypothetical world where the rules are just completely random, like television static? These worlds exist. In fact, they should be far, far more numerous than sensible worlds. Well, it looks a lot like these worlds, or this world, is what in the games is called the Breach, described as the other side of the universe, the stuff outside the world stream. It's like a storm, deadly, cannot be passed, as Elsa Nova says. Now finally, let's talk about actually instantiating these algorithms we keep talking about. If there's an infinite number of algorithms because they all exist, there are algorithms that generate further algorithms. There actually are Matrix-like situations out there somewhere. In fact, there's an infinite number of them. Ones that are exactly like each other, except a photon is in a different spot or something. And those simulations can simulate their own simulations. Forever. Thomas Happ considers this in the Omniverse, and for reasons that have to do with improving probability distributions, suggests that beings who create other universes would be motivated to also create universes where people could live forever in peace. That is, universe makers would create paradise worlds, and when you die in your simulated world, they pluck you out of it and put you into a paradise world. That might seem kind of irrelevant to everything else I've discussed, but with that I think we have enough information to actually start talking about these games, so hopefully you're still here. The first Axiom Verge starts off with Trace, and we're immediately hit with a disembodied voice telling us to find a gun. We later learn this voice comes from a giant mechanical head named Elsa Nova, who in her language is a being called a Rusalki. She says this means water machine, and that she was a soldier. In total we meet 6 of these Rusalki in the game. There are Elsa Nova, Veruska, Ophelia, Araka, Duraga, and Katrahaska. There's likely a 7th Rusalki mentioned but never seen in Axiom Verge 1 named Drushka. It's also noted that in the native Sudran language, these beings are called Kuliltu. Both of these words and mythological beings primarily have to do with water. It was noted early on by fans that these names sound Russian, except for Ophelia. It was also noted that Elsinova and Veruska are stuck in profile, their faces looking right, while Katrahaska is stuck in profile looking left. And Ophelia is frontal facing, and the two sides of her face are completely symmetrical such that it actually looks like two faces in profile looking at each other. All this made it clear from just the first game that Ophelia was different. There are notes that make this clear, the most obvious one being the outsider. In Axiom Verge 2, we learn that Indra is Ophelia, or at least Ophelia is a duplicated version of Indra born from the powers of an arm called Damu. Axiom Verge 2 also shows us Drushka, a member of a Kazakh group that left into a world they called the Emergence, which looks a lot like Sudra. The sequel tells us that the Kazakhs learned about the portal from Earth to Kingir, and in exchange for their silence were given passage, money, and 6 submarines. While at first glance it sounds like submarines just mean submarines, the game's files notes that this giant water creature in the Emergence is what is meant by a submarine. Drushka's dialogue, along with a note, reveals that she and likely the Kazakhs as a whole are deeply interested in evolution. They see the Emergence as an opportunity to study and harness this process for their own advantage. According to Drushka, time moves faster further in the Emergence compared to both Earth and Kingir. Putting it together, it looks like all the Rusalki are Kazakhs who left for the Emergence, taking part in some kind of transhumanist experiment in which they were able to turn themselves into giant aquatic machines. It's of note that all Rusalki bodies we see, including Ophelia's, are aquatic in nature. There's numerous references to water in both games, from the Shakespearean reference that Ophelia's name entails, to the several notes talking about watery caverns where the Udug come from, and watery oceans in the sky. Actually, let's talk about this for a second. We are told in a note to the Kuliltu that the original inhabitants of Sudra saw the Kuliltu as battling in the ocean and the sea above. The High Priestess then rung in the storm, causing the Kuliltu to spill upon the plains. Is the ocean metaphor just a metaphor? I personally don't think so. I think it's literal. We learn in Axiom Verge 2 that Kingir is not structured like Earth. It's not a universe full of mostly empty space with near-spherical balls of matter floating around through gravity. It's actually space filled with a literally astronomically large lattice, and this lattice supports life, at least in some places. We don't get any explanation like this for Sudra, but we do see what the surface looks like in the form of tall mountains, and from there we get to see the sky. It looks like this. Thomas Haff has called these weird things in the background the Sudran equivalent of moons. I'm fairly sure Sudra itself is shaped like this, it's just so large it's not noticeable, other than the mountains which are really spiky. These things, besides us looking cool, have always reminded me of something. They look like Radiolara, specifically Spumularia, which are protozoa endemic to the world's oceans and known for having intricate crystalline skeletons. I think then water literally takes the place of space in the universe of Sudra, and Sudra itself has an atmosphere like a bubble, or perhaps multiple bubbles, clinging to a massive Radiolaran structure. If this is the case, the Kuliltu, that is, the Rusalki, are literally water machines, which literally fought in the sea and the sky. That's interesting in itself, but it leads to some more questions. The biggest would be, what did they fight, and why? This is all speculation, but I could think of 3 things. They either were fighting each other, or the Udug, or some third thing we haven't seen yet. The motivation could be either some kind of weird Darwinistic survival of the fittest thing, which I think is unlikely, or perhaps some kind of travel access, which I think is more likely, but is probably not the full answer either. I think the most likely is an ideological rift, which I'll get to later. But Sudra was seen to be like a trans-dimensional port, and the note's reply, the outsider, notes that the Rusalki are trying to get something specific. It doesn't seem to align with what Ophelia wants, and we know what Ophelia wants. Ophelia wants control of a pattern mind so that she can get to Ansur, the mother world. One last thing I'll note here is that Duraga's Steam trading card description states she's a minor Rusalka. We also see the body of Rusalka in the background of Eden. This could mean that altogether there's more than 6 Rusalki, even discounting Ophelia, who is a different strain. It could also mean this is just, say, Araka's body in the background. But it seems strange that of all the Kazakhs that went to Sudra, only 5 stayed and survived. More likely, I think, 6 become major Rusalki, using the submarines brought from Earth, and the other evolved into minor Rusalki using other means. The pathogen is a major plot point in Axiom Verge 1. We're told that Athetos released a pathogen on Sudra, that all life on Sudra is infected with it, that Athetos used it to make the boss monsters we see by infecting clones of himself, and that he did this in order to wipe out the Sudrans so as to gain their technology. He even says this himself, after a fashion. But does this really make any sense? The pathogen isn't mentioned in Axiom Verge 2, and yet, we see it in that game. Once Indra gets Damu, if she crosses over one of the NPCs or touches them with her hand, there's a strange hidden timer that starts. As I said in my playthrough of that game, I'm still not clear on the mechanics of it, but essentially the NPC will get sick with a strange disease and slowly transform into what is called in the game's files a Sudra prototype. All NPCs will tell you to stay away from them when the disease has progressed. And interestingly, Ivan specifically will say the word demon in Russian. Actually, it's pronounced demon too. It's just demon, he's saying demon, like all the bosses in Axiom Verge 1. It looks like Damu is causing the NPCs to turn into monsters, although Damu and Indra are unaware of it. However, we're told that Damu was chosen to become an arm because he was a child. Because a child's mind is more pliable and so supposedly capable of stronger abilities. Damu says he was supposed to be able to turn his wielder into a giant beast, but is unable to do that. The arms themselves were meant to fight the Udug, invaders that initially were said to just ignore the native Sagiga as they traveled through breach portals, but turned actively hostile once the Sagiga started to attack them. This seems to imply a level of intelligence to the Udug beyond mere animals or monsters. The word Udug means demon in Sumerian. Both the Sagiga and the Sudrans write in cuneiform, which was the writing system in ancient Mesopotamia, with the former shown explicitly to have built Sumerian-style structures and wear Sumerian-style clothes. Another thing that happens is that upon first entering the emergence, you find background creatures reminiscent of Sudran wildlife, but non-interactable. However, if you come back, this wildlife turns into recognizable enemies from Axiom Verge 1. So it looks like an open and shut case then. The pathogen was caused by Ophelia, not Athetos. Except for one little snag: the corpses. Axiom Verge 1 is full of corpses in the cells of certain areas. In Axiom Verge 2, Indra's disease spreading didn't leave corpses behind, but maybe we can think of a solution for that if we work through a timeline. What's interesting to me is that the Sudrans are not native to Sudra. A few notes at the very least allude to it. In Axiom Verge 2, Lament for Fools and the Eternal Arm reference a place called Sudra. In myth, Sudra was the last king of Sumer before the Great Flood. Sudra is literally a kind of Noah analog, as there were many fairly similar flood myths during this time. Something else is that the note commemorative speech mentions the invasion of Engir, the watery caverns which the Udug are said to come from. Sudra seems to be full of caverns, as it would probably be if it was a gigantic radiolarian. The area Indi where Araka lives is mentioned to be a gigantic cavern in the Art of Axiom Verge book. The area Abzu is also explicitly said to be underground in said book, and more importantly, Abzu in Mesopotamian myth is a supposed primordial underground sea where fresh water comes from. Abzu is also called Engir. There's also the Steam profile background, Ruins of Udug. It says, "These antediluvian ruins contrast starkly the high technology of the merely ancient areas of Sudra." Antediluvian is a word meaning before the Great Flood, as in the Great Flood as described in the Bible. Finally, there's an unused note called Leaving for Sudra, which explicitly states that the Lamassu ordered the Sagiga to leave Kingir for Sudra. While I'm not sure we can take this note as exactly canon, I think we have more than enough other evidence to point to one simple fact. It looks like the Udug are the actual natives to Sudra, or at least were there long before the Sudrans were. There's an interesting little caveat to this idea though. Udug architecture is present in the Breach. Given what are called Udug in the game files of Axiom Verge 2, we also see the Udug can survive the Breach, Kingir, and Sudra, which is unlike most humans. It looks like only human patterminds can survive the Breach with any ease. So it's possible that Sudra really is a port world of some kind, and the Udug might be from another world, or the Breach, and the Sagiga just weren't aware of that, and assumed they're from the port world. At the very least, I don't think they're from the Breach, because distinctly Sagigan architecture is shown to exist in the Breach as well. If you don't remember, because I've gone on a long time to make this point, we're trying to establish a timeline. No matter what, we've established that the Udug were on Sudra first, then the Sudrans, who seem to just be Sagigans who left behind their old world. From here, things get a bit fuzzy. Both Hammond and Trace reached Sudra before the Kazakhs reached it, and Indra and then Ophelia reached Sudra after the Kazakhs did. But the note, Fated Note, already says that something happened on Sudra that was catastrophic, with the ramifications extending to everyone. We don't know what he's referring to, but something bad already happened. The first assumption we might make is that the change in perspective on Sudran technology has something to do with it. But first of all, Sudran technology was still operational at this point, whereas on Kingir they destroyed it. And second of all, a mere cultural shift into treating advanced technology with religious reverence seems to not be catastrophic, if the machines themselves are operational but just not used. Notes like the Land of Civilized Kings, Anonymous Note, and Proverb all indicate that the Sudrans knew very well why the old machines, as they call them, are not being used. They were used for war, and are kept under care by the priests so that such disasters can't happen again. This isn't really painting this societal change as some kind of societal collapse on the level of a catastrophe, at least to me. Further, the note Forbidden Knowledge in Axiom Verge 2 indicates that even the Sagigo were supposed to build and use their powerful technology without understanding how it works. This puts into question the entire assumption that there was a culture shift or societal collapse of any kind prior to the pathogen. More importantly, Trace stated in Faded Note that they're going upstream to the filter, or even further, to find out what happened. I'll get back to that in a bit, but first let's continue with the timeline. Both Trace and Hammond leave, so it's here that the Kazakhs enter into the equation. As previously mentioned, time moves faster on most of Sudra, fast enough that Drushka can see significant changes within relatively short periods of time. On Sudra, it stated that there were anywhere from centuries to millennia between the time when a man named Athetos first arrived on Sudra, and whenever that note was written. Bizarrely, this is a purple note in Axiom Verge 1, which are all notes written in English by clones of Athetos. I have no idea why a clone of Athetos wouldn't know his own history on this matter. I tend to think this was written by Ophelia, but we'll have to set the specific point aside just because there's not enough information. The note, the Kuliltu, says that it was dozens of generations before the writing of said note that the priestess rung in the storm. The Rusalki, save Ophelia, can't travel through the breach, and we know the storm is the breach. This actually completely destroys the Rusalki narrative on what Athetos' motivations are. It destroys Athetos' own story too, which remember Athetos said, quote, "If I tell you too much, your captors will have to kill you." Athetos says that when he first arrived, the Sudrans were using their technology to keep out the greater universe. This is obviously not true, because they didn't manage to keep neither Hammond, nor the Kazakhs, nor Indra out, and they didn't activate the breach attractor until the Kazakhs were already Rusalki. Further, Athetos is a pattern mind. The breach doesn't keep him out of anything. Athetos refers to Sudra as a port on the way to the greatest nation ever envisioned. This sounds to me a lot like we're talking about Ansur here, and if that's the case, Athetos doesn't need a port to get there. Ophelia does, which blows up the entire justification Athetos gives for spreading the pathogen. The note Security Notice, written by a Sudran, is suspiciously unclear on the gender of the mentioned intruder who is under suspicion of releasing a plague. The Art of Axiom Verge mentions that Ikrma is a temple that once sheltered a pattern mind that wore a red coat. That red coat is Trace's, and sheltered is a strange word to use for an intruder. The note journal page Zeder is interesting in light of Axiom Verge 2. The author is a clone of Athetos, and to me the note is talking about a foreign mind within his own mind taking over, a mind that calls itself Zeder. In Axiom Verge 2, when NPCs get sick from Indra, they turn into Zeder prototypes. Therefore, we can conclude that the default result of getting sick from whatever Ophelia is doing is turning into a Zeder specifically. This, as well as the note's transcription and journal page Uruku, all indicate confusion on what exactly is happening to the Athetos clones and why. Nevertheless, the Athetos variants, as they're called, clearly follow the orders of Athetos, who states before his boss fight that he was protected from the pathogen first by a more portable device, but when you fight him, he's using the device that turns people into arms. In the end, I have no reason to believe that Athetos released a pathogen. However, I'm not convinced that either the Rusalki generally, or even Ophelia, are aware that it's her who's done it. The only sticking point is still why there are large amounts of corpses in the cells, but I do have a theory. The note Public Notice tells people to flee to the cells. They might have done so and simply starved to death. The note says that both the High Priestess and Nin Aruna have died of the plague, which means people died outside of the cells, but you rarely see any corpses in other areas. I can think of only one example, and it's not even far from the cells. You also notably see corpses on tables, as if eating. Perhaps they weren't eating, and that was the problem. Now that I have shown all my evidence that Athetos had no motives or means to release the pathogen, while Ophelia did, let's discuss what the pathogen actually does. To do so, we must harken all the way back to my discussion about the rules of this setting and how minds work. We should also return to the note journal page Uruku. Moving past the first paragraph we already discussed, it reads, "But what of Uruku? This is not so much death as a deadly aberrant dementia. The algorithm itself is twisted, changing from one moment to the next. There is not any one point at which Athetos ends and Uruku begins, simply a continuum of torment. Were I to die now, would I awaken mercifully as my former self, or as this amalgamation, forever seeing danger in every shadow?" Let's recall that Damu is fundamentally able to give Indra/Ophelia the ability to travel through the breach, at least in a limited capacity. She can't do it when in humanish form, but she can in drone form. But the breach doesn't hurt her even as a human when she has Damu. And what is the breach? The breach is the non-world stream part of the Omniverse. The world stream is the tree-like structure that the universes like Earth are in. If, then, the worlds are the tree and its fruit, the breach is just everything else. It sounds then like the pathogen causes the mind and body to draw from the breach and match it in some way. The algorithm that defines your mind is twisted and made chaotic. The breach is chaotic and deadly, so your mind becomes chaotic and senses danger. This pathogen is trying to twist you to fight the Udug, so now your body is turned into a monster and your mind sees the Udug everywhere. What do I mean when I say draw from the breach? It's time to get on yet another tangent and talk about pattern minds. The note Beware the Pattern Mind in Axiom Verge 2 states that pattern minds derive their powers directly from Ansur, which is the mother world. If I have my metaphors right, this is the root from which all other worlds, or at least this section, derive. Taking a look at the note, Letter from Trace, the root is broad, and as worlds branch out, they're filtered into narrow specific endpoints which are other worlds. So I think it goes like this. We have our tree, and it starts with the base, which we'll call our root. Then it branches at least once. We call this our filter, and it's filtering out useful possibilities. Non-useful ones are relegated out into the breach. These branches themselves filter out worlds, that then filter out more and more, forever. But it all goes back to the root. If pattern minds derive their powers from the root, moving back to our computer science metaphors, pattern minds have root access. They can make downstream changes nobody else can. Literally, they're a power user. This explains both why Trace can use the Axiom disruptor and the program disk that alter its function, and also why it's called an Axiom disruptor in the first place. It destroys your mind and body at a universally fundamental level. This also puts the address disruptor, or glitch gun, as most people call it, into perspective. In computer science, an address is the identifier that tells the computer where specific data is stored, so it can be accessed and manipulated later. As somebody with literal universal root access, the glitch gun takes the parts that make up you and messes with their addresses. The local universe pulls from the wrong places, seemingly at random, and random defines the breach. This also explains why storm bombs are called storm bombs, why they have the same effect as the address disruptor, and can destroy anything. Moving back to the pathogen, I said in my Axiom Verge 2 playthrough that I thought the note, the Eternal Arm, might actually be referring to Lama and not Damu. Having thought about it more and laid all this out, I think I was wrong then and it must be referring to Damu. Given my hypothesis here about how Damu's pathogen works and why, it makes sense that Damu could survive storm bombs and reform himself. He draws power from the breach the same way a pattern mind draws from the root. Just an idle thought as I think about this, but this could all have happened because Damu was a kid when turned into an arm. If a child's mind is more nimble, as the note Plague of Thoughts says, this might be a way of saying that a child's mind has more potential, not set in its ways. I think we all think this, but another more negative way of phrasing this is that it's chaotic. A child doesn't know what they want. They don't have enough information to have a fully formed sense of self. Why not then that an arm made from a child starts to draw power from the breach? Given Athetos is a pattern mind, this also provides a good framework for understanding how, if Athetos didn't release the pathogen, he could still use it to create specific clone variants. Being smarter and more experienced than Trace, perhaps he's able to exert some measure of control over how messed up you get when your flesh starts to chaotically reform. I spent a lot of time so far laying groundwork and showing that a lot of what we're told on a surface level reading of the game is not what's going on. So what is going on? Keep in mind a lot of this is more speculation, but I think it's well founded. To understand what's happening, we need to understand two things. One, the Lamassu seems to have a connection with Ansur, and two, the Udug are not supposed to be traveling. Starting with the Lamassu, we know it has terminals all over King Gear, and there are even shapes on Sudra that resemble tiny Lamassu terminals. It's also pre-programmed with directives that seem mainly focused on the maintenance and isolation of the worlds from each other. I didn't mention it before, but Thomas Happ in his Omniverse posts states that universes that make simulations would have a strong motivation to enforce a no-contact rule. Though to be honest, I don't really follow his argument for this, so we'll just take it as a given. Moving to the Udug, in the note Storm Bomb, we're told that the Udug seemed almost casual at first about the effects of their breach portals, using them just as doorways. That is, until the Lamassu started instructing the Sagiga on making weapons to fight back. The note Goodbye by Dr. Hammond, like the note Faded Note, reiterates that there's something wrong. but she's writing on King Gear and also gives specifics. The barriers between worlds are slowly degenerating, and there's no apparent attempts to correct course. We might notice that breach portals are open both on King Gear and on Sudra, and you can even travel from one to the other using open breach portals. Earth, King Gear, and Sudra have things called breach elevators, meant to protect you from the breach and allow travel through the other worlds. Though it appears that there are other ways of traveling to other worlds, it seems to me that going through the breach is one of the more universally applicable ways, though still not easy. Let's look at our world tree again. Worlds are at the ends, and we want to travel. We have two obvious paths. One is to travel through the breach, the other is to travel up the stream. In Axiom Verge 2, when Indra uses a breach elevator, she's going through the breach, traveling across. Traveling this way shows visible glitching effects. The final boss of Axiom Verge 2 involves the main villain, Amashilama, attempting to travel to Ansur, or to the root, via a device that was clearly approved of at the time by the Lamassu, since it never got destroyed. And when Indra uses the big egg cup, she travels up the stream to the filter. Likely, this filter is the one governing King Gear, Sudra, and Earth. Theoretically, it should be possible to travel up to the filter from King Gear, then back down to Earth. I can't help but notice that this giant egg cup is with all the other Sagiga technology, but wasn't destroyed. The Lamassu then probably directed the Sagiga to build this, and I think it's through this method that the Sagiga traveled to Sudra. The Udug didn't travel this way though. They go through the breach. Both Trace and Hammond from their notes seem to think whatever's going on is happening to all the worlds downstream of the root. If the Lamassu has some kind of connection to the root, it looks like he's having trouble because he's not getting any software updates. But the mere appearance of the Udug shows something has gone terribly wrong. Traveling through the breach isn't supposed to happen, and as time progresses, it's clear nothing is being done about it upstream. So the Lamassu does the best he can. First he directs the Sagiga to attack the Udug. Maybe he thinks the Udug will take the hint and stop. But they don't take the hint, and their offensive use of the breach only makes the problem worse. The note Lament for Fools mentions the Udug War just ended, not through victory, but for unknown reasons. The Udug simply stopped traveling. In the main story of Axiom Verge 2, Hammond states to Indra via an Ansible that output data throttling has resulted in input overflow. In effect, millions are trapped in detention. By this point in the story, Hammond is dead and is in a previously discussed afterlife world. Well, that's what I said at the time. In reality, Hammond and millions of others are stuck in a buffer. Output data is being throttled. Put in more normal terms, the rate of universe travel has been intentionally reduced upstream. My theory is, this is the Lamassu's doing, and the Lamassu did this to stop the Udug. If the rate of travel has been lowered, perhaps the Udug simply couldn't field the men required to adequately fight the Sagiga and decided to give up. Maybe they chose another route. Either way, the war was over. Except people still die, and there's still a system in place to pluck dead people seamlessly from their home worlds to an afterlife world. Thus we can say then, the original output from the mortal worlds was set to accommodate all natural deaths into afterlife worlds. When data output was throttled, this resulted in input overflow. That means there was a buffer world to which excess numbers of people were stored. But if the rate of death keeps steady, or worse, increases, the number of people stuck in the buffer keeps increasing. Resources are taxed, and eventually this could result in errors, data loss, or system crash. Errors could be catastrophic to worlds. In fact, the random standing breach portals themselves might be errors. Data loss would mean people in the buffer would be deleted, or in other words, they would die for real. And a system crash might be a collapse of entire universes. No matter what, this is bad. So Elizabeth Hammond managed to contact Indra and use her daughter Samara as leverage to get Indra all the way up to the filters so she can hack the terminal to allow Hammond root access. Since this is obviously a complete hack job, it's difficult and limited, but Hammond does say it works. It results in the immediate evacuation of the buffer, and at least that problem is solved. But whatever Hammond did was to solve the problem of the afterlife buffer specifically. It clearly didn't solve the greater problem, whatever that is exactly. And then we have Axiom Verge 1. If Sudra really is a port, using the breach attractor is supposed to close the port. If the original problem was the ability of people to cross the breach attractor is an attempt to fortify the breach to stop crossings. If this is right, the High Priestess's activation of the breach attractor wasn't random. It was yet another extreme backup measure to solve a problem that's been plaguing everyone since the Udug War. Athetos on this reading knows this, and is keeping the breach attractor activated not to imprison the Rusalki per se, but to stop traffic because it looks like breach traffic is destabilizing. Given how long it's been, I wouldn't be surprised if Athetos has been to Ansur and seen the problem firsthand, but maybe not. This leads us to discuss our actual main villains, and the thing that unites them is that they're seemingly completely ignorant of this multiverse degradation problem, and instead have weird selfish goals. I covered Amashu in my Axiom Verge 2 playthrough, but to summarize, she believes that King Gear's instantiation by Ansur acts as a chain, restricting King Gear's destiny. Having gone on for so long about the plot and setting, I've come to realize this does make sense and seems motivated, rather than insane or random. The Udug War was devastating for King Gear. Amashu witnessed her civilization being destroyed by the orders of a machine directly connected to the so-called Mother World. This machine offered her no justification for its actions, and in fact insisted the people didn't know the specifics of what they were doing. After enduring such a war, it's no wonder she views Ansur as arbitrary and destructive, a leash that King Gear must cast off if it is ever to determine its own fate. To achieve that, Ansur must be destroyed. The execution of King Gear's algorithm binds it to Ansur, which is why she says in the note, The Ideal King Gear, that every King Gear that finds itself tied to an Ansur must destroy it. I explained in my playthrough that Amashu here means ideal as in idea, not perfected or optimistic. Amashu has no conception that something is drastically wrong upstream. Or maybe she does, but even if she did, this would only be more evidence that Ansur must be destroyed. If she lived in a non-executed King Gear, there's nothing upstream to go wrong. Either way, everybody except Athetos, I suppose, thinks destroying Ansur isn't a solution. Meanwhile, on Sudra, Drushka is an idiot obsessed with evolution, technology, and transhumanism. Ophelia has gotten it into her head to go to Ansur specifically for technology, so they team up, but it looks like Drushka doesn't inform the other Rusalki what the plan is here. In Axiom Verge, the existence of the note Plan B means there was a Plan A. The author of Plan B seems to be Ophelia. If that's the case, the main objective was probably simple, to gain Athetos' cooperation. Ophelia mentions in a cutscene that she used a device called a scry to locate Trace. It's obviously a lie that this was how she found Trace, considering Trace is a clone, but a scry is mentioned by Hammond in the note Goodbye, so it's plausible she successfully found Athetos, or a clone, or both, which would have been ironic since she already had access to Sudra. Now here's something I haven't mentioned before. Common wisdom assumes that the note, The Outsider, is written by Elsinova to Veruska. I think it's obviously written to Veruska, but I don't see any reason to assume it's written by Elsinova. What if it was written by Katrahaska? Now hear me out. I said previously I was confused by the note Letter, that it was an English note supposedly written by an Athetos. But it says something all Athetoses should know and mentions Drushka. This note is also found directly below where Athetos is. So I think what happened here is Ophelia did find a scry, realized that Patternmind was on Sudra, and went after him with an informal alliance with Drushka, who wants access to an Ansur just for the technology it has. The Rusalki weren't made aware of the specifics, merely introduced to another powerful Rusalki by Drushka, and at least some of them went along with it. Maybe others didn't. This, I think, would explain the Rusalki fighting in the space water. Then the priestess activates the breach attractor, perhaps at Athetos' behest, because he now knew the Rusalki were trying to travel to other worlds instead of just floating around and evolving or whatever they were doing before. And everything now is a mess for the Rusalki. Ophelia continues to try and get Athetos' cooperation, fails, and due to the pathogen spreading, Athetos eventually has to flee to his boss room. Ophelia fails to get to him. Somewhere around this time, Katrahaska is tired of Ophelia's nonsense, eventually turning against her, which means turning against the few remaining Rusalki. Ophelia wins this fight, and so we get Plan B. I think that makes sense, and I think it even works with the idea that Ophelia and the Rusalki are unaware of Damu's disease spreading. But obviously I could be entirely wrong about all of this. In the end though, we know Athetos is killed, and Trace is put to sleep and put in a dream world by Veruska. But now we also know death just sends you to another world, and dream worlds are just as real worlds. So now the ending of Axiom Verge 1 should make some sense to you. So I think that about covers it. I mean, there are other things I could comment on, like how Note's journal entry, Dangerous Ideas, mentions that the Udug are able to manipulate an invisible lattice that seems to imply the Udug all have the power of pattern minds. Or that the giant beam Elsinova uses to kill Athetos is the Fat Beam, a secret weapon Trace can get, and that unused Katrahaska art seems to indicate she also had a Fat Beam. Or that the note, My Lovely, looks a lot like it implies Veruska tortured Araka into insanity by trapping her in endless varying universes and killing her repeatedly, which has implications for what it means for Veruska to think of herself as a predator, and for the ending of Axiom Verge 1 and how difficult it probably is to really escape her clutches. or that I haven't explained anything about the spatics metaphor and all the stone reliefs that show all these stylized spatices and world trees. But I think I've said enough that any further speculation can be taken up by you, my dear viewers. Maybe you have a startling revelation that upends the very fabric of my theories. Maybe you can point out some blatantly obvious fact that I've overlooked that collapses everything I've said like a house of cards. Or maybe there's just a lot of little things going on in these games and I didn't mention something you yourself have noticed. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed the video. So until next time, see ya.